Hello, my name is Michael Kim.
And my name is Rocco Russo, and our project focuses on slugging analytics in Major League Baseball.
For this project, we will be talking about the purposes for our work and the metrics we will be using. We will also go into detail about the models we created, as well as the motivation and results for and from creating them. Finally, we will conclude by drawing comparisons between the models and examine interesting findings we had from the models we created. To start, we will be going into our intended purposes for this project. Essentially, Major League Baseball players go through good and bad hitting cycles on a seemingly random basis. Because of this, we would like to be able to potentially answer the following questions. What contributes to a player's performance slugging on a yearly basis? Can we estimate a player's future performance based on prior data? And can we analytically determine players who are over and underrated? In order to do so, we have elected to do the following. We will create and execute regression models with peripheral factors to predict a player's slugging percentage, develop a function approximation neural network to predict future slugging statistics for major players, and compare these results between the two predictors. By doing these three things, we hope to be able to answer the previously posed question and come up with interesting and consequential conclusions about hitting in the major league. We also hope to find information not provided by MLB resources that could further explain hitting success in the MLB. To get more into the specifics of what we're attempting to analyze, we first have to introduce peripheral stats and StatCast. StatCast is a camera tracking technology introduced in the 2015 season, and it gave way to a whole new sector of baseball analytics known as peripheral stats. Some examples of peripheral stats include pitch spin rate, perceived velocity, pitch breakdown, launch angle, exit velocity, and whiff rate. Essentially, these are all metrics determined by cameras and visuals rather than outcomes. This is an advancement that has changed the way baseball is currently being played. Additionally, we were able to find all this data as it is supplied by baseballsavant.com. As for what we are attempting to measure, we have chosen the metric of slugging percentage to base both of our proposed models. Slugging percentage is a way to measure the effectiveness of a batter over the course of a season. The exact formula for slugging is as follows. Slugging percentage is the sum of singles plus 2 times doubles, plus 3 times triples, plus 4 times home run, all over the number of at-bats in a given season. One benefit to using slugging percentage is that it excludes walks, both intentional and unintentional. While this contributes to a batter's performance and offensive effectiveness, this is not exactly what we are choosing to put a focus on. As for other possible metrics, the competition for a determinant metric was OPS+. The reason we chose not to go with the metric are as follows. OPS+ has much more complicated formula and it may convolute the data. Additionally, OPS includes walk rate, which, as previously mentioned, we did not want to include. This is because walk rate has a very limited peripheral stat line and isn't able to help us explain the variation. For the regression model, we chose to create a multilinear regression. Given the possible metrics to choose from, we felt this would be the best way to get a successful prediction of slugging. The variables we chose to use for this model are launch angle, launch speed, and whiff rate. Launch angle is the angle at which the ball leaves the bat at the point of contact. Launch speed is the speed at which the ball leaves the bat at contact. And finally, whiff rate is the percentage of total strikes on swings that were not tipped foul. The exact formula for whiff rate is total strikes minus fouls over the total swings made. We determined that these are the most effective peripheral stats to use as, of the available stats, these factors are the least dependent on the performance of the opposition. This means that these stats are the least affected by a pitcher's pitch range, speeds, and performance. Additionally, as baseball has moved to a home run-focused offensive approach, we took these variables into account as they are likely what coaches inform their players to improve upon the most. Here we have the results of our multilinear regression model. We can see that launch angle, launch speed, and whiff rate are all significant at an alpha level of 0.001. This means that for our ability to determine slugging percentage, each of the three variables we chose to include are influential on the model. However, the R-squared value is 0.3687. This implies that only approximately a third of the variation in our data is explained by our model. This is less than we would hope, but it is still decent considering baseball metrics are very variable. Other things to note are that the launch angle and launch speed have relatively low coefficient estimates. The launch speed is on a range of anywhere from 80 to 140 miles per hour, so this large multiplier is what constitutes a small coefficient. Additionally, launch angle is typically in the range of 10 to 60 degrees, So this is a less effective model than the launch speed, but is still greatly influencing more than we would suspect due to the coefficient. Finally, the whiff rate has a decimal value, so the large negative coefficient that we see actually has less pervasive influence than we would expect.
For the second half of our project, we focused on building a neural net. Similar to the regression model, its goal is to predict slugging percentage for a player based on exit velocity, launch angle, and whiff rate. Our goal with our neural network is to identify nonlinear relationships between our various features and our output variable. In our multiple linear regression model, we are only able to identify linear relationships, while a neural network is flexible enough to be a universal function approximator, which will allow us to potentially find any nonlinear relationships that exist. The neural net implementation can be broken down into 3 stages. In order to properly use a neural network, all data that is entered into the neural network must be normalized. For this project, I normalized my data, whiff rate, exit velocity, and launch angle, and in addition, the output, slugging percentage, on a range from 0 to 1, with 0 being the minimum value for that feature and 1 being the maximum value for that feature. We then take that normalized data and use ReLU activations with 2 hidden layers of size 4 and 2 respectively. A lot of people use a lot of hidden layers when making neural networks, but especially in a neural network with very few features like ours, it is important to keep it small so that we do not fall victim to overfitting. Beyond that, to properly interpret our results, we will have to denormalize our data, as all the results we receive from the neural net will also be on the range 0 to 1, with 1 being the best predicted slugging percentage from any of the players that are entered, and 0 being the worst predicted slugging percentage. We can do that by just putting it in the inverse of our original normalization function. Here I have an image of our neural net. As you can see, we have 3 features that we put in. Exit velocity listed as launch speed, launch angle, and whiff rate. They enter the neural network. Again, we have bias terms at each hidden layer, including the final output layer. And as you can see, we have the various activations that will occur on each of these. The weights are listed on there, but they're a little small to see. Now that we've built 2 models for this project, we can now take our results and make some conclusions from them. The first thing we have to do upon completing this is validate our models. You saw the output for the regression model, so you saw its significance. However, there is no easy image to output for the neural net. We investigated the mean square error of both, and we found both to be 0.00397. These sound like very good mean square errors, and while they are relatively low, it is a little underrated due to the percentage nature of the slugging percentage stat, where squaring it will actually make the number smaller rather than larger. Another thing to note is that both of these mean square errors are very similar. One thing that this may indicate is that there were not any particularly nonlinear relationships between the data, which isn't particularly surprising since naturally hitting the ball harder will have a direct relationship with the odds of the ball leaving the park, which does contribute to slugging percentage. On this slide, I've made a table with the players who were overperforming with their actual slugging percentage relative to the predicted slugging percentage from our models. These are all the data on this slide is from our neural network model, since it had slightly better mean square error, and the rank they had in this ordering in the multiple linear regression model is listed on the screen as well. One interesting thing we see on this slide is Bryce Harper, the previous season's MVP, is actually in the overperformer category. This is actually pretty expected, considering he's not superhuman and hitting the ball way, way harder than anybody else, and does lend some credence to the idea that being the absolute best player in baseball requires a little bit of luck to be on your side. Beyond that, we see players that had small sample sizes, such as Frank Schwindel. Obviously, we remove players with only 1 or 2 plate appearances, but there are still players that will have extremely impressive stats in short periods of time. Schwindel was of particular note because he did not actually hit the ball very hard, which is why the difference between his predicted slugging and actual slugging is so pronounced. Beyond this, if we look at these players' stats in the new season, we'll find that every single one of them is underperforming their previous season slugging percentage, with Mike Zunino and Jake Rogers especially having terrible seasons so far. Most of these players have slugging percentages relatively close to their predicted slugging percentage, and their peripheral stats for this season also reflect the peripheral stats from the previous season, suggesting that the model is working as intended. On slide 17, we have the underperformers in the same mode as we had the overperformers on the previous slide. Unsurprisingly, none of the people on here had particularly good seasons last season, with several of them even being released from their team in the off-season. One commonality between all these players is that they were actually hitting the ball very hard during the previous season and may have just been victims of bad luck. Another thing to note is players like Jackie Bradley Jr., who are having much better seasons this season to start the year, which could indicate that the underlying factors are, in fact, very important. Another player that came very close to making the list but didn't actually was Cody Bellinger, who finished 7th in the underperformers category. A former MVP, he hit the ball very hard last season and had solid peripherals, if not amazing. However, he was one of the worst players in all of Major League Baseball, with negative 1.5 WAR. His slugging percentage this season so far has been off the charts. He's seemingly resurgent, and a lot of people are surprised by this. But even if you look at one of the worst years I've seen from a Major League Baseball player, he was actually hitting the ball pretty hard and was in a lot of ways just unlucky. Now to look at some of the big picture takeaways rather than looking at individual players. As I said on the overperformers slide, something that we saw was that a lot of the best players in the league were considered overperformers. This suggests something unsurprising, that not everything can be boiled down to launch angle and exit velocity. The best players in the league have that something extra, and that's why their slugging percentage is consistently over the bar. When looking at the training data, players with impressive seasons, such as Mike Trout, are almost always significantly above the prediction that the model makes for them. Beyond that, we found that players who only had a small sample size to prove themselves were outliers in the data set. Players like Byron Buxton and Mike Trout last season were hurt very early on, and as a result, their already staggeringly impressive numbers were not considered sustainable by the model. And the model was correct in that assertion. Nobody has ever had a season like Byron Buxton was on pace to last year. Another problem is the first impressions. A lot of the people that were underperformers, according to our model, were actually hitting the ball very hard. But those players that you found at the very bottom of the model, who the model suggests should be around league average hitters, they aren't on teams anymore, and that could be a opportunity for teams looking for players that might overperform your expected stats. Beyond that, we found that power hitters were unsurprisingly rated very highly. In a model that focuses on launch angle and exit velocity and predicts slugging percentage, you would expect power hitters to rule. And this was especially true with our model, which especially liked players such as Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, and Vladimir Guerrero Jr., who just hit that ball that extra bit harder than any other player in the league. So obviously, with this model, we couldn't do everything we wanted. One thing that I found in the data was that the model was continually underrating particularly fast players, such as Byron Buxton and Ronald Acuna Jr. Speed is a very important part of baseball. It allows you to gain an extra base on a hit or leg out and infield single, and our model was not able to account for this because of the limited availability of speed stats that could be considered peripherals that we could use to analyze the ability of a player to have a high slugging percentage. Beyond this, one of the other limitations of our model was the focus on slugging percentage. Generally, OPS is used, on base plus slugging percentage, which focuses more on a player's ability to get on base, whether it's through a hit or a walk. The reason I elected not to use on OPS is because I could not find any peripherals that particularly addressed the importance of walks, which is an important factor in on-base percentage, considering it's literally in the name, on base. Beyond this, as mentioned on the previous slide, models like this can absolutely be used to somewhat game the system in a sense, as the Oakland A's did. This is a concept behind Moneyball to identify players that are underperforming relative to their peripherals, and use models like these to predict players that will improve, even if the stats suggest that they are, well, quite frankly, terrible.